The bullet that lodged itself in Samuel Preston's chest 6 years ago never killed him, but it made him decide he would never be the man holding the gun again. And that choice turned out to be the thing that made an entire town believe Aaron Nash was the worst kind of yellow-bellied coward who ever wore spurs in Deadwood. Dorothy Sinclair stood behind the teller window at First Bank of Deadwood on a Tuesday morning in late August 1877, listening to Margaret Fletcher run her mouth for what had to be the 100th time about the incident at the Golden Nugget Saloon 3 months prior. The story had calcified into legend by now, each retelling adding another layer of scorn, another detail that made Aaron Nash seem smaller, weaker, less than a man in a town where being less than a man meant you were nothing at all. "He just stood there," Margaret said, leaning against the counter with her voice pitched loud enough that the miners waiting in line could hear every word. Big Tom Rafferty called him out, said he cheated at cards, and Aaron Nash just put his hands up like he was being robbed and backed right out the door. Did not even try to defend himself. What kind of man does that? Dorothy counted out bills with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving automatically while her mind wandered to a different image entirely. She had seen Aaron Nash 2 weeks ago on Front Street when a freight wagon had spooked a young mare tied outside the hardware store. The animal had been thrashing against her rope, eyes rolling white with terror, and men had been shouting and moving toward her with whips and harsh hands. Aaron had walked up slowly, hands loose at his sides, and started talking to that horse in a voice so low and steady that Dorothy had stopped sweeping the boardwalk just to listen. He had not touched the mare for a full 5 minutes, just stood there speaking to her like she was a frightened child. And when he finally did reach out, the horse had gentled under his palm like she had been waiting all along for someone to understand that fear was not something you beat out of a living creature. Dorothy had thought about that moment more than she cared to admit. She was 24 years old, had been working at the bank for 3 years, and had developed a finely tuned instinct for measuring the difference between what people said they were and what they actually proved themselves to be when no one was watching close enough to care. "He is probably afraid of his own shadow," Margaret continued, accepting the money Dorothy slid across the counter. "My husband says he is surprised Aaron even stays in Deadwood. A man like that should move somewhere civilized where they do not expect you to stand up for yourself." Dorothy smiled the tight, professional smile she had perfected for customers whose opinions she did not share. "Will there be anything else, Mrs. Fletcher?" "Just the truth, Miss Sinclair. Just the truth about cowards walking among us." After Margaret left in a cloud of righteous indignation and expensive perfume, Dorothy served the next customer and the one after that, working through the morning crowd of miners depositing dust and businessmen arranging transfers. The bank was small but solid, built from local timber with iron bars on the windows and a heavy safe in the back room that took 2 men to open. She had learned the work quickly when she had arrived in Deadwood from St. Louis 3 years earlier, fleeing a mother who had wanted her married to a dry goods merchant with soft hands and a softer mind. Dorothy had wanted something bigger than that life, something that felt real and hard-edged, and the Dakota Territory had seemed like the place where a woman with a head for numbers and no patience for drawing-room manners might carve out something that belonged to her alone. She had not expected to find herself thinking about a cowboy the whole town despised. Aaron Nash came into the bank just before noon, moving with that same unhurried grace she had noticed with the horse, his hat in his hands and his eyes the color of creek water under summer sun. He was tall and lean, built like a man who worked for his living, and there was something about the way he held himself that made Dorothy think of a drawn bowstring, all that potential energy held perfectly still. "Miss Sinclair," he said, and his voice was exactly what she had imagined it would be, low and steady and carrying that same quality he had used to calm the frightened mare. "Mr. Nash." She kept her voice neutral, professional, aware that every eye in the bank had turned toward them. "What can I do for you? Need to make a withdrawal. Got a payment due on some feed." She processed the transaction quickly, counting out his money with fingers that stayed perfectly steady even though something in her chest had started beating faster. Up close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands were scarred and calloused from honest work, the carefulness with which he held himself, like a man who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a world that wanted to push him out entirely. "There you are," she said, sliding the bills across the counter. "Much obliged." He met her eyes for just a moment, and something passed between them that Dorothy could not name but felt in the hollow of her throat. Then he was turning away, settling his hat back on his head, and she watched him walk out into the harsh Dakota sunlight while the whispers started up behind him like a wave breaking against stone. "Can't believe he shows his face in public," someone muttered. "Probably too stupid to know he should be ashamed," came another voice. Dorothy bit down on the inside of her cheek and went back to her work, but the anger that had been building in her for weeks now felt like something with teeth and claws, something that wanted out. She saw Aaron again 2 days later at the general store, and then 3 days after that at the livery stable, where he kept a handsome bay gelding named Copper. Each time, she noticed something new. The way he thanked the store clerk with genuine warmth, the gentle competence with which he handled his horse, the fact that he never seemed to shrink under the weight of the town's contempt, but simply moved through it like water flowing around stone. Dorothy found herself engineering excuses to walk past the livery, to linger near places where she might catch sight of him. It was foolish and she knew it, but there was something about Aaron Nash that had gotten under her skin like a splinter, and she could not stop worrying at it until she understood what it meant. On a Friday evening in early September, she was closing up the bank alone, Mr. Henderson having left early for his wife's birthday supper, when Aaron walked past the window. Without thinking it through, without giving herself time to reconsider, Dorothy locked the door behind her and called out, "Mr. Nash." He turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Sinclair, I was wondering." She took 3 steps toward him, her skirts kicking up dust on the wooden boardwalk. What really happened that night at the Golden Nugget? Something shifted in his expression, a guardedness settling over him like a door closing. "You heard the story. Everybody has heard the story." "I heard what people say. That is not the same thing as the truth." He studied her for a long moment, and Dorothy felt the weight of his attention like something physical. The street around them was emptying out as people headed home for supper, the September sun dropping toward the black hills and painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "Why do you care?" he asked finally. "Because I think there is more to you than what this town has decided you are." The words came out more forcefully than she had intended, carrying all the frustration she had been holding back for weeks. "I have watched you, Mr. Nash. I have seen how you are with animals, with people who do not matter enough for you to bother performing for. And I do not believe a man who can gentle a terrified horse with nothing but patience and a steady voice is a coward." Aaron's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would simply walk away. Instead, he said, "You want to take a walk, Miss Sinclair. This is not a conversation for the middle of Front Street." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to pine forest, and the air smelled like resin and approaching autumn. Aaron did not speak until they were well away from any ears that might carry his words back to the saloons and boarding houses where reputation was currency and gossip was gold. 6 years ago, I was working on a ranch outside Cheyenne. he began, his voice quiet but steady. There was a card game that went bad, accusations of cheating, the kind of situation that happens 100 times a week in cow towns from here to Texas. A man named Samuel Preston pulled a gun. He was drunk, angry, not thinking straight. I was 21 years old and thought I knew everything there was to know about being a man. He paused, his hands flexing at his sides. I drew faster, shot him through the chest before he even got his barrel up. Killed him dead in front of a dozen witnesses who all agreed it was self-defense, that I had not had a choice, that any man would have done the same. Dorothy listened, her heart beating hard against her ribs, understanding beginning to bloom in her chest like a dark flower. The thing is, I did have a choice, Aaron continued. I could have talked him down, could have walked away, could have done a dozen things that did not end with a man bleeding out on a saloon floor while his sister screamed and his mother got the news that would break her heart clean in two. But I was young and stupid and convinced that being a man meant being willing to kill rather than be killed. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of something raw and honest. So I made a vow that day, watching them carry Samuel Preston's body out in a pine box. I swore I would never draw on another human being for as long as I lived, that I would find another way, any other way, to settle disputes. Even if it meant people thought I was yellow, even if it meant being run out of every town I tried to settle in. And that is what happened at the Golden Nugget, Dorothy said softly. You kept your vow. Big Tom Rafferty was drunk and looking for a fight. I gave him my winnings and walked away. Could have taken him apart without breaking a sweat, but that is not the point. The point is choosing something different than what violence offers. He shook his head. But you are the first person in Deadwood who has even asked for my side of things. Everyone else just decided what they thought and let that be the truth. Dorothy felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. The town is wrong about you. The town does not want to be right about me. They want someone to look down on, someone to feel better than. I am convenient for that. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a kind of weary acceptance that made Dorothy want to reach out and touch his hand, though she did not quite dare. It must be lonely, she said instead. Some, he admitted. But loneliness is better than becoming something I have sworn not to be. They walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, and when they parted at the corner of Front and Main, Dorothy felt like something fundamental had shifted in her world. She went home to her small rented room above the milliner's shop and lay awake most of the night, thinking about vows and courage and what it meant to stand by your principles when the whole world told you that you were wrong. She started finding reasons to talk to Aaron after that. Small conversations at first, passing words about the weather or the price of feed, but gradually growing longer, more substantial. He had a quiet sense of humor that surprised her, a way of seeing the absurdity in human behavior without being cruel about it. They talked about books they had read, places they had been, the difference between the frontier mythology and the grittier reality. Dorothy found herself laughing more than she had in years, found herself looking forward to the moments when she might catch sight of him on the street or in the general store. The town noticed, of course. Deadwood was too small and too starved for entertainment not to notice when the bank clerk started keeping company with the town coward. Margaret Fletcher made pointed comments about Dorothy's judgment, and Mr. Henderson suggested gently that she might want to be more careful about her associations, given her position at the bank. Dorothy ignored them all with a steely determination that would have made her mother proud, though for entirely different reasons than her mother would have preferred. Aaron, for his part, seemed both pleased and worried by her attention. I do not want to drag you down with me, he told her one evening when they were walking along Deadwood Creek, the water running low and clear over rounded stones. "This town has a long memory for the wrong kinds of things. Then they can remember that I chose you with my eyes wide open," Dorothy said firmly. "I am not some delicate flower who needs protecting from public opinion, Aaron. I came to Deadwood because I wanted to live on my own terms. And my terms include spending time with a man who is worth 10 of these puffed-up peacocks strutting around pretending their willingness to shoot each other makes them superior." He looked at her with something fierce and tender in his expression, and Dorothy felt her breath catch. They had been dancing around this thing between them for weeks now, this pull that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. "You are something else, Dorothy Sinclair," he said softly. "I could say the same about you, Aaron Nash." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough and gentle all at once, and the touch sent electricity skittering down her spine. "I am falling in love with you," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no game playing or coyness. Just the plain truth laid out between them like an offering. "Have been for weeks now, if I am being honest, but I need you to understand what that means. It means being associated with a man this town despises. It means hearing things said about your judgment, about your virtue, about your common sense. I will understand if that is not something you are willing to take on." Dorothy's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She had never been one for grand romantic gestures or flowery declarations, but she understood the weight of what he was offering her. This was not some passing fancy or convenient arrangement. This was a man who had looked at the hardest parts of himself and chosen to become something better, and who was now offering her his whole honest heart with no pretense and no conditions. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, and watched his face transform with quiet joy. "And I do not give a damn what this town thinks about it." He kissed her then, soft and certain under the darkening Dakota sky, and Dorothy felt like she had finally found the thing she had been looking for when she left St. Louis 3 years ago. Not adventure or independence or escape, though those things mattered, but this. A partnership built on honesty and respect, with a man who knew himself well enough to choose principle over pride. They courted openly after that, and if Deadwood had opinions about it, and Deadwood most certainly had opinions about it, Dorothy refused to let them touch what she and Aaron were building together. They took walks along the creek and shared meals at the boarding house dining room and talked about what kind of life they might make together. Aaron wanted to open his own livery eventually, a place where horses would be treated with the respect they deserved. Dorothy wanted to keep working, using her head for numbers and her talent for organization. Neither of them saw any reason why they could not have both those things, build something together that belonged to them alone. October came cool and crisp, the aspens in the hills turning to gold, and Dorothy started to believe that maybe they could make this work despite the town's contempt. Aaron was patient and steady and unfailingly kind, and she loved him with a fierceness that sometimes surprised her. She had not known she was capable of feeling this way about another person, this sense of absolute certainty that she had found her match. And then, on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, everything changed. Dorothy was at her usual place behind the teller counter, processing a deposit for John Chen, who ran the laundry on Sherman Street, when the door to the bank slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. 3 men burst in, bandanas pulled up over their faces and pistols drawn, and Dorothy's heart lurched into her throat as she recognized the sick reality of what was happening. "Nobody move," the lead man shouted, his voice high and tight with nerves. He was young, Dorothy realized with a strange detachment, probably not even 25, and his hands were shaking badly enough that she could see the tremor even from where she stood. "This is a robbery. We want the money from that safe, and we want it now." Mr. Henderson had gone pale, his hands rising slowly. The handful of customers in the bank froze like rabbits scenting a wolf. Dorothy's mind was racing, trying to calculate angles and odds and outcomes. The robbers were terrified, which made them unpredictable and dangerous. One wrong move and people would die. "The safe is in the back," Mr. Henderson said, his voice remarkably steady. "It takes 2 people with keys to open it. Miss Sinclair has 1 key, I have the other. Then both of you get back there and open it," the lead robber snapped. "Now, before I shoot someone to prove I am serious." Dorothy moved toward the back room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, her mind still racing through possibilities. If they opened the safe, the robbers would take the money and leave. That was the best outcome, the one that ended with everyone still breathing. But these men were young and scared and armed, and scared men with guns made mistakes that could not be taken back. She was halfway to the back room when the door opened again, and Aaron Nash walked into the bank. Time seemed to slow down and stretch out like taffy. Dorothy watched Aaron take in the scene with one comprehensive look. The masked men with their guns drawn, the terrified customers, her and Mr. Henderson frozen in place. His hands were empty, she realized with a lurch of terror. He was unarmed like always, had kept his vow to never carry a gun again, and now he had walked into a bank robbery with nothing but his bare hands and that same steady calm he brought to everything. "Get down on the floor," one of the robbers screamed at him, swinging his pistol around wildly. Aaron did not get down. Instead, he closed the door behind him gently and took 3 slow steps into the bank, his hands held out to his sides where everyone could see them. "You are scared," he said, and his voice was that same low, steady tone he had used to gentle the frightened mare, to tell Dorothy the truth about Samuel Preston, to speak every honest thing he had ever said. "You are terrified right now, and your hands are shaking, and you are thinking that maybe this was a terrible mistake, but you are in too deep to back out now." "Shut up," the lead robber shouted, but there was something desperate in his voice, something that confirmed everything Aaron had said. "I am not armed," Aaron continued, taking another careful step forward. Dorothy wanted to scream at him to stop, to get down, to do anything but walk toward those shaking guns, but she could not seem to make her voice work. "I am not here to stop you or hurt you or be a hero. I just need you to listen to me for 1 minute, because I have been where you are right now, and I know what happens next if you keep going down this road. You do not know anything about us." The second robber's voice cracked on the last word. "I know you are not killers," Aaron said. "I can see it in how you hold those guns, in how high your voices are going, in the fact that you have not hurt anyone yet, even though you have had plenty of opportunity. You are desperate men who thought this would be easy money, a way out of whatever hole you have fallen into. And I am telling you that it is not worth what it costs." He was close enough now that Dorothy could see the sweat on the lead robber's face, could see the way his finger was white-knuckled on the trigger. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break right out of her chest. "6 years ago, I killed a man," Aaron said, and his voice carried to every corner of the bank, clear and strong and full of hard-won truth. "He pulled a gun on me and I pulled faster and I shot him dead. It was self-defense, clean and legal, and everyone told me I did the right thing. But I have carried the weight of Samuel Preston's death every single day since then. I see his face when I close my eyes at night. I hear his sister screaming. I know that I took a man out of this world forever and left a hole in the lives of people who loved him, and it does not matter that I had the law on my side. It still cost me everything that matters about being human." The third robber, who had not spoken yet, lowered his gun slightly. Dorothy could see the uncertainty spreading through all three of them like ripples in water. "So I made a vow," Aaron continued. "I swore I would never draw on another person again, that I would find another way always, even if it meant people thought I was a coward, even if it meant risking my own life, because I would rather die being the man I chose to become than live being the man I was afraid I might be." He stopped moving, standing perfectly still in the middle of the bank with his empty hands still held out. "And I am asking you now, begging you, not to become the men who pull those triggers, because you cannot take it back once it is done. You cannot undo the moment when you decide to hurt someone. It will follow you for the rest of your lives, and it will cost you things you do not even know you have yet." The silence in the bank was absolute. Dorothy could hear her own breathing, could hear the creak of floorboards as someone shifted their weight, could hear the distant sound of a freight wagon rolling past outside. The lead robber's gun was still pointed at Aaron's chest, but his hand had stopped shaking quite so badly. "We need money," the lead robber said, and his voice had gone quieter, almost pleading. "My brother is sick and the doctor wants payment up front, and I do not have any other way to get it." "There are other ways," Aaron said gently. "Harder ways maybe, ways that take longer and hurt your pride. But ways that let you look at yourself in the mirror afterwards. Ways that do not end with you hanging from a rope or spending the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders." He took a deep breath. "I know what it costs to be desperate. I know what it feels like to think you have run out of choices. But I am standing here, unarmed, asking you to choose something different than what fear is offering you. Because you still have time to walk out of here and be men who can live with themselves tomorrow." For a long, terrible moment, Dorothy thought it was not going to work. She thought these desperate, frightened men were going to pull their triggers, and Aaron was going to die right in front of her. All that quiet courage and hard-won wisdom snuffed out, because he refused to meet violence with violence. Then the lead robber let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh and lowered his gun. "This was so stupid," he said, his voice breaking. "This was the stupidest thing we have ever done. But you can stop doing it right now," Aaron said. "You can walk out that door and make different choices. It is not too late." The three robbers looked at each other, some wordless communication passing between them. Then, one by one, they put their guns away and turned toward the door. The lead robber paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Aaron. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "Why did you risk your life for a bank that probably does not even pay you?" "Because I believe people are worth saving," Aaron said simply, "even when they are not sure they deserve it. Especially then." The robbers left, walking out into the October sunlight, and Dorothy heard herself make a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the floor, her whole body shaking with reaction. Aaron was at her side in an instant, kneeling down and gathering her into his arms. "You are all right," he murmured against her hair. "You are safe, I have got you. You could have died," she managed to get out, her fingers clutching at his shirt. "They could have shot you and you walked in there with nothing, with no way to defend yourself, and you could have died." "But I did not," he said, "and neither did they. Everyone gets to go home tonight. That matters, Dorothy. That is what matters." Mr. Henderson was already running for the sheriff's office, and within minutes, the bank was full of people wanting to know what had happened, how 3 armed robbers had walked out without taking a cent, why Aaron Nash was still kneeling on the floor holding Dorothy Sinclair like she was the most precious thing in the world. The story spread through Deadwood like wildfire. By nightfall, Everyone in town knew what had happened at First Bank, knew that Aaron Nash had walked into an armed robbery unarmed, had talked 3 desperate men down from violence, had revealed the truth about his vow and the reasons behind it. The whispers that had followed him for months twisted into something new, something Dorothy could feel shifting every time she walked down the street over the next few days. "Can you believe we called him a coward?" she heard someone say outside the general store. "That took more guts than any gunfight I have ever seen," came from a miner at the boarding house. "He saved those boys from hanging, probably saved whoever they might have hurt. That is real courage right there." The town's shame and newfound awe were almost comical in their intensity. Men who had sneered at Aaron for months now wanted to buy him drinks, shake his hand, tell him he was the bravest man in the Dakota Territory. Women who had sniffed disapprovingly at Dorothy's choice now smiled at her on the street and said what a fine man she had chosen. Even Margaret Fletcher, who had led the charge in tearing down Aaron's reputation, approached Dorothy at the bank with something like contrition in her eyes. "I was wrong about him," she said stiffly. "About Mr. Nash. I judged without knowing, and that was unchristian of me." Dorothy accepted the apology with more grace than she felt, but privately she was annoyed by how quickly the town had reversed itself. They wanted to make Aaron into a new kind of legend now, wanted to turn his vow into something heroic and mythic, wanted to claim him as their own after months of treating him like dirt beneath their boots. Aaron, for his part, wanted no part of it. "I am not a hero," he told Dorothy one evening as they walked along their familiar path by the creek. "I did what I thought was right in that moment, same as I have been trying to do every day since Samuel Preston died. I do not want to be Deadwood's redemption story or their example of frontier virtue. I just want to live my life on my own terms with the woman I love." "Then that is what we will do," Dorothy said firmly, lacing her fingers through his. "We will build the life we want and let the town think whatever it wants to think." 2 weeks after the attempted robbery, Aaron came to dinner at Dorothy's boarding house room with a proposal that had nothing to do with marriage, though she had been hoping for that too. "There is a property for sale on the edge of town," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Used to be a livery and blacksmith shop, but the owner died last spring and his widow wants to move back east to live with her daughter. I have enough saved to make a down payment, and I could have the business running again within a month." He reached across the small table and took her hand. "I know we have only been courting a few months, and I do not want to presume, but I keep thinking about building something that belongs to us. A place where horses are treated right, where people can come and know they will get honest work for honest pay. And I keep seeing you there with me, Dorothy. Managing the books, keeping everything running smooth, being my partner in every way that matters." Dorothy's heart felt too big for her chest. "Are you asking me to go into business with you?" "I am asking you to marry me," Aaron said, and there was nothing but certainty in his voice. "To build a life with me, here in Deadwood or anywhere else you want to go. To be my wife and my partner, and the person I come home to every night for the rest of my life. I love you, Dorothy. I love your sharp mind and your kind heart, and the way you see people for who they really are instead of who they pretend to be. I want to spend the rest of my days earning the trust you have put in me." "Yes," Dorothy said, and she was crying and laughing all at once. "Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage and partnership and building something that belongs to us. Yes to you, Aaron Nash, exactly as you are." He kissed her across the table, nearly knocking over the coffee pot in his enthusiasm, and Dorothy thought that this was what love was supposed to feel like. Not the swooning romance of dime novels or the careful transactions of society marriages, but this. 2 people choosing each other with clear eyes and full hearts, committed to building something honest and real. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Methodist church, with Mr. Henderson giving Dorothy away and half the town in attendance, despite Aaron's protests that he did not want a fuss made. Dorothy wore a dress of deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and Aaron wore his best suit with a new string tie. And when they spoke their vows, Dorothy felt the weight and promise of them settle into her bones. The livery stable opened for business in early December, the sign over the door reading, "Nash, Livery and Stable Honest Work for Honest Pay." Aaron had spent weeks repairing stalls and mending tack and getting everything ready, and Dorothy had thrown herself into setting up a proper bookkeeping system, organizing the feed orders and customer accounts with the same efficiency she had brought to the bank. She had left her position there despite Mr. Henderson's protests, and she did not regret it for a moment. This was hers in a way working for someone else had never been, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared vision. The first few months were harder than either of them had anticipated. Money was tight and work was long, and Deadwood's enthusiasm for Aaron's heroism did not always translate into actual customers. There were still people who remembered the old stories about the coward who walked away from fights, who preferred to take their business to the other stable in town. But slowly, steadily, Nash Livery built a reputation for quality work and fair dealing. Miners brought their mules for shoeing and discovered that Aaron could diagnose lameness better than any horse doctor in the territory. Freighters started requesting him specifically to repair broken harnesses and wagon wheels. And people who came once tended to come back, drawn by Aaron's quiet competence and Dorothy's efficient management. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, and by the time their first anniversary rolled around, Nash Livery was turning a small but steady profit. Dorothy had never worked harder in her life and had never been happier. She loved the rhythm of their days, the way she and Aaron moved around each other in comfortable partnership, the satisfaction of building something from nothing with their own hands and wits. The town had settled into a new understanding of who Aaron Nash was, though not quite the legend some people wanted to make him. He was simply a man who kept his word and did his work and treated people with respect, and that was enough. The story of the bank robbery still got told in saloons and boarding houses, but it had lost some of its mythic sheen, becoming just another part of Deadwood's complicated history. On a warm evening in June 1879, 2 years after that afternoon in the bank when everything had changed, Dorothy and Aaron sat on the porch of the small house they had built next to the livery, watching the sun set over the Black Hills and enjoying the rare pleasure of finished work and empty time. "Do you ever regret it?" Dorothy asked, her head resting on Aaron's shoulder. "Not the bank, but all of it. The vow, the years of people thinking you were a coward, everything you gave up to become the man you chose to be." Aaron was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "I regret that Samuel Preston died. I regret that I was the kind of young fool who thought killing someone made you a man, but I do not regret the choice I made after. It cost me things, sure, but it gave me more. It gave me a way to live with myself. It gave me you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I would make the same choice again tomorrow." "Good," Dorothy said, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it now, cannot imagine being anywhere but right here doing exactly this. Building a life on our own terms," Aaron said softly. "On our own terms," Dorothy agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over Deadwood, the lights beginning to wink on in windows up and down the gulch. Somewhere in town, a piano was playing, and someone was singing off-key but enthusiastic, and the familiar sounds of a mining camp settling in for the night floated up to them on the warm summer air. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Deadwood continued to change and grow, the wild early days of the gold rush giving way to something more permanent and established. There were droughts and economic downturns, difficult customers and horses that could not be saved, days when Dorothy's head ached from balancing books that refused to balance, and nights when Aaron came to bed exhausted from work that never seemed to end. But there were more good days than bad. There was the afternoon. A young woman brought in a terrified colt, and Aaron spent 3 hours gentling it with the same patience Dorothy had first fallen in love with, then refused payment because he said some things mattered more than money. There was the winter. Dorothy managed to negotiate a contract with the big freight company that kept them flush through the lean months. There was the quiet satisfaction of customers becoming friends, of building a reputation that rested on integrity rather than legend. They talked sometimes about children, but the discussion always circled back to the same conclusion. Their life was full enough as it was, rich with purpose and partnership and the daily satisfaction of work well done. They had each other, had the business they had built together, had the respect of a town that had learned to see past its own prejudices. That felt like abundance to both of them, a different kind of legacy than bloodlines and heirs. By 1885, Nash livery had become an institution in Deadwood. The town itself had calmed considerably, the wild violence of the early mining days giving way to something more settled. Electric lights were coming to Front Street, and there was talk of a telephone exchange. Aaron had taken on an apprentice, a young man named Peter who showed real talent for working with difficult horses. Dorothy had started teaching bookkeeping to miners' daughters who wanted skills that might take them beyond washing laundry and serving drinks. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Aaron surprised Dorothy with a trip to Cheyenne. They took the stage down through the Black Hills and across into Wyoming, staying in a proper hotel with indoor plumbing and eating in restaurants where someone else did the cooking. It was a luxury they could finally afford, and Dorothy reveled in it. But what she loved most was simply being away with Aaron, having time to focus only on each other without the constant demands of the livery. They talked about everything and nothing, laughed over shared memories, made plans for the years ahead. "We have done all right, haven't we?" Aaron said one evening as they walked through Cheyenne's downtown, his arm around her waist. "Built something worth having." "We have done better than all right," Dorothy said. "We have built exactly the life I hoped for when I left St. Louis all those years ago, a life that belongs to us, on terms we chose for ourselves." "No regrets?" he asked, echoing her question from years before. "Not a single one," Dorothy said, and meant it with her whole heart. They returned to Deadwood refreshed and ready to dive back into work. The livery was thriving under Peter's temporary management, and Dorothy was pleased to find all her accounts in order and a new contract waiting for her approval. Life settled back into its familiar rhythms, satisfying and full. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the steady accumulation of small joys. Aaron's reputation as a horseman spread beyond Deadwood, and people would bring animals from 50 miles away for his assessment and care. Dorothy expanded their business to include a feed and tack shop, leveraging her connections and business sense to create a new revenue stream. Together, they became pillars of the community not through dramatic gestures or mythic moments, but through the quiet accumulation of integrity and competence. There were still people who remembered the old stories, who would occasionally bring up the attempted bank robbery or the accusations of cowardice. But those stories had lost their power to define Aaron. He had become simply himself, a skilled horseman, a principled businessman, A devoted husband, a man who kept his word and helped his neighbors and refused to be anything other than who he had chosen to become. Dorothy watched him age gracefully into middle years, silver threading through his hair, lines deepening around his eyes. She watched him gentle frightened animals and mentor young workers and keep his vow even when it would have been easier to break it. And she loved him more with each passing year, loved the man he had been, and the man he continued to choose to be. In the spring of 1895, 20 years after Dorothy had first arrived in Deadwood and 18 years after that afternoon in the bank, Aaron and Dorothy celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Peter had taken over most of the daily operations of the livery by then, buying out half the business and giving Aaron and Dorothy the freedom to step back from the constant grind of work. They sat once again on their porch, older now but no less devoted to each other, watching the sun set over hills that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. 20 years, Dorothy said, wonder in her voice. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been exactly here. Best 20 years of my life, Aaron said, pulling her close. Every single day of them, even the hard ones, Dorothy asked, a smile in her voice. Especially the hard ones, Aaron said. Because we got through them together. They had built something that mattered, Dorothy thought. Not the kind of legacy that would be written in history books or turned into frontier legends, but something better. A life of integrity and partnership, a business that served their community, a marriage built on honesty and respect and deep, enduring love. They had taken the hardest thing about Aaron's past and transformed it into something that defined the best of who he was. No gun had ever hung on the wall of their home or business. Aaron had kept his vow for almost 3 decades now, had found ways to navigate every conflict and challenge without resorting to violence. And Dorothy had stood beside him every step of the way, his partner in all the ways that mattered. As darkness fell over Deadwood and the stars began to emerge in the vast Dakota sky, Dorothy thought about that young woman who had arrived here so many years ago, fleeing a life that did not fit and seeking something she could not quite name. She had found it in the most unexpected place, in a man the whole town thought was a coward, who had turned out to be the bravest person she had ever known. "I love you," she said, the words as true now as they had been the first time she spoke them by the creek all those years ago. "I love you too," Aaron said, and kissed her as the first stars winked into being overhead. They sat together in the darkness, content and complete. 2 people who had chosen each other and built a life that mattered on their own terms. The town around them continued its nightly routines, but for this moment, there was only the 2 of them, the life they had made, and the absolute certainty that they had found exactly what they were meant to find in each other. The story of the bank robbery would be told for generations in Deadwood, becoming part of the town's folklore. But for Aaron and Dorothy Nash, it was simply one moment in a long and richly lived life together. They had built their happiness not on that single dramatic afternoon, but in the accumulation of thousands of ordinary days, choosing love and partnership and integrity over and over again, until those choices became the foundation of everything they were. And in the end, that was the truest kind of courage, not the dramatic gesture or the heroic moment, but the daily decision to be better than fear wanted you to be, to love more than caution advised, to build something honest in a world that often rewarded pretense. They had done that together, and the life they had made was their legacy, proof that choosing truth over reputation could lead to something beautiful and lasting. Years later, when Dorothy was old and Aaron's hair had gone completely silver, they would still sit on that porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sun set over the Black Hills. And every time, Dorothy would remember that afternoon when a cowboy walked into a bank robbery unarmed and changed not just his own life, but hers forever. It remained the moment when everything that mattered had begun, not with violence or gunfire, but with courage of a different kind entirely, the kind that saved lives instead of taking them, the kind that built futures instead of destroying them. It was the moment when she had truly understood what it meant to choose love over fear, partnership over isolation, and truth over the comfortable lies that people told themselves to feel superior. And it was the foundation of the happiest, most fulfilling life she could have imagined. A life built on nothing more and nothing less than two people choosing each other, every single day, for the rest of their lives together.